I married the man I loved most for 6 years. Unfortunately, he didn't feel the same way about me. Even after we had a child, he rarely came home. When our son fell ill and passed away, his father was skiing with his first love. But when he returned home, the first thing he said was, "Why didn't you take better care of our child?" I thought leaving him would change my life. But fate played a cruel joke on me. 1. My son stopped breathing in front of me. He was so young, so pale, but the last thing he said to me was, "Mom, don't be sad. I can become a little angel again." At that moment I fainted. When I woke up, everything around me was blurry. I was lying in bed, and my son was no longer there. I saw my mother-in-law walk in from outside, her face ashen. How could you take care of a child? He was doing so well before. How could he suddenly? You're such a terrible mother. These words pierced my heart, but I couldn't feel the pain anymore. Suddenly, I heard a voice from outside. Where is the child's father now that the child is gone? Where did my child's father go? Oh, he went skiing abroad with his true love. I just found out about this yesterday on his social media. There were sweet and loving photos of the two of them skiing on the snow. 2. I stood numbly in the funeral parlor, as wave after wave of guests came to pay their respects. Everyone looked so sad, but they were all just acting. Everyone knew Nelson didn't like me. I only managed to marry into the Nelson family by forcing it with the power of my own family. They only reluctantly agreed to the marriage for the sake of their interests. After I entered the Nelson family, my mother-in-law ignored me, and my husband didn't love me. I lived my life cautiously, afraid of making even the slightest mistake. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside, and many people were calling out, "President Nelson." Nelson returned looking cold. He went straight to me and questioned me. "Yara, what have you been doing all day? Why couldn't you even take care of your own child? If you didn't want to raise him, you should have said so earlier. Why wait until the child is gone to regret it? Are you deliberately trying to spite me?" At that moment, the funeral parlor was crowded with people, watching us as if they were at a circus. I thought it was absurd. When my child was seriously ill, I called him, and he coldly said, "Deal with it yourself, I don't have time." Then he hung up the phone. When I called again later, his phone was already turned off. Now he was here blaming me for not taking good care of the child. I didn't want to deal with him, so I turned my head away. As soon as I turned my face, a dizziness hit me, and my vision blurred. Before I lost consciousness, I seemed to hear someone calling my name, but eventually I passed out. I opened my eyes in the darkness, and my head ached. Looking at the light coming through the window, all I could think about was Malcolm. Happy, sad, innocent. The door was pushed open, and a figure walked in. He stood by the bed, looking at me quietly. I didn't want to see him at all now. I felt like vomiting whenever I saw him. I turned away and curled up into a ball. He said, "I'm sorry." But those 3 words meant nothing to me. The person he owed the biggest apology to was Malcolm. In Malcolm's last moments, he asked me, "Where's Dad?" "Malcolm wants to see Dad." I forced a smile and told him, "Malcolm, you'll see Dad as soon as you open your eyes." Unfortunately, he never got to see his long-awaited father until he passed away. I felt colder and colder, and I curled up tighter. "The doctor said you fainted because you were too sad and hadn't eaten," Nelson said calmly. "Go out and eat something." How could he be so calm? That was his own son. Even if he didn't love me, he was still his flesh and blood. He agreed to the marriage at the beginning, but right after the wedding, something big happened to my family, and I suddenly went from being the wealthy Miss Yara to a down-and-out woman. And he didn't even try to hide the fact that he went to see his first love the next day. Not only did he not love me, he even hated me. After all, if I hadn't insisted on marrying him back then, he would have been with the woman he loved long ago. I could bear this bitterness myself, but Malcolm did nothing wrong. Why didn't he get his love? I tried to control my emotions. Where were you on the day Malcolm got sick? I called you. At the airport. Then he added, "I thought you were tricking me into coming home again. You've done this kind of thing before." And the story of the boy who cried wolf always gets annoying. In the end, he just thought I had tricked him again. But didn't I do that every time, because Malcolm wanted to see him? If I didn't lie to him, would he come home to see him? I was so stupid. I know, just go. Nelson walked to the bedside and looked at me. Yara, don't you think you should give me an explanation? Why does your child have heart disease? I found it ridiculous. Malcolm was diagnosed with heart disease 2 years ago. Everyone knows that. Don't you know? Nelson was stunned, his eyes dimmed. I couldn't help but sneer. Nelson, you've never really cared about your child. What does he mean to you? Do you know that Malcolm was looking for you when he was finally taken to the emergency room? He knew he wanted to see his father as soon as he opened his eyes. You don't know, because you were happily skiing with your so-called lover and didn't care about your son's fate at all. Nelson looked flustered and stammered. Didn't you call me? Look at how many missed calls you have on your phone. I did call, but you just turned off your phone. Forget it, there's no point talking about this now. Nelson, I was wrong. I was wrong to marry you. I was wrong to fall in love with you. I should have left this place with Malcolm long ago. As I was about to get out of bed, my mother-in-law suddenly burst in. She came in and started to scold. Yara, you are so useless. You are a complete waste. Then she grabbed my hair. Give me back my grandson. It's because of your sin that Malcolm got this disease. When she slapped me hard, I laughed out loud. Tears and laughter mixed together, and I fell to the ground. Nelson just watched silently, as if everything was natural. It wasn't like this before. When we weren't married, he would feel very sorry for even a small wound on me. It's just that everything changed when I was no longer of any value to him. I was so foolish back then, and a little bit of tenderness could make me lose my judgment. Struggling to get up, I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth and walked towards my mother-in-law step by step. You're asking a good question. Why does Malcolm have heart disease? It's a genetic disease. No one in the Yara family has ever had a similar medical history. Who has the problem? It's your Nelson family's problem. Why should I take the blame? I also slapped her back without hesitation, returning all the humiliation I had suffered over the years. 3. The sky was particularly gloomy on the day Malcolm was buried. Of the people standing around, how many had come out of genuine sympathy? And how many were just here to watch the show? I turned around and saw Zara, the woman Nelson loved. The woman who always got all of Nelson's attention and affection. What was she doing here at a time like this? Was she just here to see me in my misery? But it didn't matter anymore. I turned my gaze back to Malcolm's tombstone. The photo on it was taken a few months ago. Since discovering that Malcolm had a heart problem, I had taken him to have his picture taken almost every month. I was so afraid that he would suddenly leave, so afraid that I wouldn't even have a single memory left. The last photo was supposed to be a family portrait of the 3 of us, but I waited from morning to night, and Nelson never came. In the end, we just took a photo of my son and me. I quietly said to Malcolm in my heart, next time, choose a warm family and enjoy a happy life. At that moment, Nelson came forward and placed a small toy car in front of Malcolm's tombstone. Hesitating, I couldn't help but ask, "What's this about?" Nelson replied expressionlessly. Malcolm mentioned last year on his birthday that he wanted a toy car for his next birthday as a gift. So it seems he was preparing a gift for next year's birthday. But why give it now? Did Malcolm know he wouldn't have much time left then? That kid was so clever. Yet he still longed for more love from his father. I tried to control my emotions and stepped back a few steps. Through my blurred vision, I saw a figure pass by. It was Zara. She was wearing a black coat and holding a chrysanthemum. It looked like she was just putting on a show. This was probably the scene she had hoped for the most. When I learned that Malcolm was going to die, she called me. Yara, Malcolm is so pitiful. At such a young age, he won't have the chance to experience what it's like to be rich, she said with a mocking tone. Do you think he'll hate the person who brought him into this world? If something really happens to you, what else will you rely on? She spoke so unscrupulously that it chilled me to the bone. Now, standing by Malcolm's tombstone, she gave me a victorious smile. Yara, are you okay? Remember to take care of yourself, or Malcolm will be uneasy underground. These were all hypocritical words. I pushed her away. That angered Nelson. Nelson grabbed my hand tightly and said, apologize to Zara. Was I really wrong? I just didn't want my child to see such an embarrassing scene at the last moment, and he got angry about it. But what if it had happened to Zara? What would his reaction have been? I said to him in a low voice, "Let go, Nelson. I don't want to talk about these boring things here. Please let Zara leave first, or you can all go." Feeling his grip tightening, I finally broke free from him. His face was ashen, and he had no intention of leaving, nor did he intend to let Zara go. I forced a smile and didn't say anything else. When I left, Nelson didn't stop me, but went with Zara. I watched her get into Nelson's car. I was about to call a taxi when I was pulled back. "Where are you going? Get in the car." I was forcefully pushed into the back seat. It was such an absurd situation. All the way, I kept staring out the window, feeling colder and colder, until I was shivering. "Yara, are you okay?" Zara turned her head, pretending to be casual. "Just take it easy," I replied. I looked at her directly. "Zara, you seem pretty happy." "Well, no wonder you think so. With the child gone, I can't stay at the Nelson house anymore, and you'll naturally become the real Mrs. Nelson. Of course you're happy." A stiff expression appeared on Zara's face, and she secretly glanced at Nelson's face. But Nelson said nothing. I sneered. The atmosphere in the car became tense. When we arrived at the old Nelson house, I didn't expect to see Lachlan, the grandfather, sitting in the living room. Of all the people in the Nelson family, Lachlan, Nelson's grandfather, was my favorite. Our two families had a deep friendship for generations, so I had grown up under Lachlan's grandfather's watch. Even after my family went bankrupt and I married into the Nelson family, Lachlan's grandfather was still kind to me as always. "Grandpa," I called softly. The old man walked slowly towards me and said with concern, "Good child, you've suffered." I shook my head. "Grandpa, I think I'll go upstairs and rest for a while." Before letting go of my hand, Grandpa patted it, and I knew he was comforting me and telling me he would handle the rest. Without worrying about what might happen next, I went straight to my room. This marriage ended the day my family went bankrupt. I was just foolishly hoping that Nelson would change his mind and expecting a miracle. But it was just a daydream. I started packing up my things and Malcolm's things, filling 3 suitcases. Looking at it this way, I realized that we had accumulated quite a lot of things over the years. Downstairs, I could hear the sound of broken glass and crying, which made me even more annoyed. I felt like I couldn't breathe staying in this place for even a second longer. I left a divorce agreement on the table, avoided them, and quietly left the Nelson villa through the back door. This place no longer had anything to do with me, and I could finally breathe freely. 5. Unfortunately, on my way home from the Nelson villa, I got into a car accident and died on the spot. Perhaps my soul, unwilling to accept my fate, returned to the old Nelson house. I arrived just in time for the drama unfolding in the Nelson family. Nelson was kneeling in front of grandfather Lachlan, his face filled with pain, but he still didn't forget to protect Zara in his arms. Zara was crying in Nelson's arms, pleading, "Please don't hurt Nelson. We just love each other sincerely. What did we do wrong?" Indeed, it's true that you love each other sincerely, but what about Malcolm, who never got to see his father until the very end? And what about me, who died such an unclear death? Grandfather Lachlan trembled with anger upon hearing this. He pointed at Nelson and scolded, "You bastard! If you dare bring that woman into this house, you will never be welcome here again, and I will disown you as my grandson. Do you know how much Yara has endured and sacrificed for this family? You beast!" After saying that, grandfather walked aside and asked the maid to bring me something to eat. The maid knocked for a long time, but no one opened the door, and finally came down and shook her head to tell grandfather. Grandfather sighed, said nothing more, and turned back to his room. After grandfather left, Nelson helped Zara up and carefully adjusted her clothes. "Are you hurt anywhere?" Zara shook her head with red eyes, looking very wronged. The usually cold Nelson showed such tenderness when facing Zara. Seeing this, even though I was prepared, my heart was deeply stung. He rarely showed tenderness to Malcolm, let alone to me. The last time he was gentle with me was before Zara appeared. Nelson and I were practically childhood sweethearts. When I was a child, I was a troublemaker, and wherever there was excitement, I would be there. And Nelson was always the one to clean up my messes. Until I met Zara in high school, and it caught me off guard. At my 18th birthday party, Nelson didn't come. When I found him, I saw him watching a beach light show with Zara. The light show was beautiful, and they looked perfect together. It was the first time I saw Nelson's gentle expression on someone else. Suddenly, a possessive desire burned within me. I ran forward and interrupted their romantic moment. They were just like now, with Nelson tightly protecting Zara, afraid that I would do something drastic. Now, it seems like everything has returned to the starting point. Without me and Malcolm, perhaps they would be even happier. 6. I saw Nelson gently place Zara on the sofa, his hands still gently stroking her belly. "I'm so sorry, you're pregnant and you've been so frightened." At that moment, I felt like I had been struck by lightning. What was Nelson saying? Was Zara really pregnant? No wonder he didn't care about Malcolm. No wonder he wasn't willing to come home to see Malcolm. It turns out he had someone else who was pregnant. Zara had a shy and embarrassed expression on her face, as if she was whispering something. Nelson smiled helplessly and got up to pour her a glass of water. What a harmonious and warm picture. When I was initially pregnant, I was very upset because of the Yara family matter, and I couldn't eat or sleep well. During the time Malcolm came, I didn't even notice. It wasn't until I started having severe morning sickness and was vomiting all day that I lost a lot of weight. That was when Nelson came to see me. I was overjoyed and went to him with the pregnancy report. But the first thing he said to me was, "What happened to you?" When I said I wasn't feeling well, he just frowned and said, "Drink more hot water." My hopes were dashed. From beginning to end, he never asked why. "I'm pregnant." Nelson looked incredulous at first, then returned to calm. Throughout the whole process, there was no excitement. "In that case, just take good care of yourself at home." As soon as he finished speaking, his phone rang. It was Zara calling. I didn't hear what was said on the other end, but I saw Nelson in a hurry. He left again, leaving me behind. Suddenly, I didn't want to stay here anymore and decided to leave. But as soon as I touched the door, my whole body felt like it was on fire, even worse than the car accident. So I returned to the old house. After trying several times, I finally realized that I couldn't leave this place or leave Nelson. Suddenly, I felt weak all over. I numbly looked at the two people in front of me. Zara was holding a glass of water and turned Nelson's face, asking, "Will you break up with Yara? I have a child now, and I don't want him to be illegitimate." Nelson gently placed his hand on her belly, as if sighing. "Wait a little longer. Yara is definitely unstable now. Give her some more time." I smiled coldly. Nelson seemed to care about my current mood, but Zara was clearly dissatisfied with this answer and slapped his hand away. "But the baby won't wait. What will happen when your belly gets bigger? You still love Yara, don't you?" Nelson was stunned and opened his mouth but said nothing. The scene suddenly became very quiet. Zara's face changed, and she stared at him intently. Then Zara slowly kissed Nelson on the corner of his mouth. Nelson didn't resist, but instead grabbed the back of her head and deepened the kiss. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I couldn't help but retch. "Nelson, you won't abandon me, right?" Zara nestled in his arms, seeking reassurance. "If it weren't for Yara, we would have gotten married long ago." Faced with this question, Nelson chose to ignore it, but instead stood up and helped Zara up. "Let's go, I'll take you home." He carefully escorted Zara out, as if she were a fragile piece of porcelain. 7. When Nelson returned to the old Nelson house from Zara's place, it was already 10 o'clock at night. He pushed open the bedroom door and saw the divorce agreement on the table. I saw him clench the paper tightly, his fingers tightening little by little. Suddenly, as if he had thought of something, he rushed forward and pulled open the closet door. There was only his clothes left inside, the other half was empty. I used to love putting our clothes together, feeling that it made us closer. But once, because I couldn't find a black shirt, Nelson got angry and yelled at me. I was so scared I didn't know what to do. After that, I reorganized the closet and completely separated our clothes. Thanks to that adjustment, I was able to leave so quickly now. Nelson closed the closet silently. Then he walked to the window, merging into the darkness, standing quietly, with red marks on his fingers. His face was expressionless, but his thumb kept rubbing. This was how he was when he was thinking. Was he wondering where I had gone? Or was he disappointed because he didn't see me? I really couldn't guess. Then he took out his phone and swiped through an interface. I saw the call history. The last unanswered call was on the day Malcolm died. I tried to contact him, hoping he could come to see Malcolm off for the last time. But the phone on the other end said, "The number you dialed is switched off." However, Nelson dialed my number again, but no one answered this time. He tried twice more, but no one answered. On the third try, a clear look of anxiety appeared on his face. Then he opened our previous chat interface. "Where are you?" I found it ironic. Does it make any sense to ask this now? No matter what the motivation was, it was destined to be a stone sinking into the sea. After all, I was no longer alive. After staying on the balcony for more than an hour, Nelson returned to the bedroom, his face very gloomy. He opened his phone impatiently, confirmed there was no new message, and then threw it on the bed. He put on his pajamas and lay down. That night he tossed and turned, getting up from bed several times to check his phone. So the next morning, he had obvious dark circles under his eyes. 8. I don't know if it's my imagination, but I felt like Nelson was a little out of it at work today. He seemed to be thinking about something else during the meeting, and he didn't pay attention to what the people below were reporting. He even needed his assistant to remind him to come back to his senses. It was the same during overtime at night. He kept checking his phone. He was looking at everything related to me, either the call records or the chat windows. But strangely, there were no new messages on either interface all day. I guess he must have heard the news about Yara's family going bankrupt. Besides Nelson's house, I had nowhere else to go. Besides, I didn't have many friends when I was young, but I did make quite a few enemies. I saw him call my good friend Kendrick. According to Nelson, Kendrick and I were the same kind of people. We were both not the kind of people who were honest and law-abiding. When I was a kid, I was the only one who got into trouble, but when I grew up, it was the two of us who caused trouble. However, Nelson never liked Kendrick, always saying that Kendrick was a bad influence on me and that I should stay away from him. But in fact, it was Kendrick who accompanied me through the days when I didn't have Nelson. It was also Kendrick who helped me through the difficult time of my teenage heartbreak. "Hey, it's rare for you to call me, Nelson." Kendrick's voice was lazy and casual on the other end. Nelson asked stiffly, "Has Yara contacted you?" "Huh?" Kendrick sounded incredulous. "Nelson, are you quick-witted? Didn't you forbid Yara from contacting me before? She always listens to you. How could she come to me?" Nelson was stunned, and after 2 seconds he continued to ask, "Are you sure she really didn't contact you?" Kendrick seemed to understand something and became serious. "You mean something happened to Yara? She's missing? Isn't she supposed to be in the hospital taking care of Malcolm?" Nelson didn't speak. At this point, Kendrick seemed anxious. "Nelson, don't stop. What happened?" "Malcolm passed away a few days ago. After returning from the funeral yesterday, Yara disappeared. I called her but she didn't answer, and I texted her but she didn't reply. Can you help me find her?" Kendrick just hung up the phone. Nelson sat there, staring blankly out the window, until the phone rang again. "Nelson, I couldn't reach her." Hearing this, Nelson sneered. "Kendrick, you don't mean much to Yara either." Then he hung up the phone. As soon as he got home, Nelson received a call from Zara, and he rushed to the hospital and found Zara in the ward. When he saw Zara, Nelson breathed a sigh of relief, and his expression calmed down. "How could you be so careless? Didn't I tell you not to wander around? If something happened, you should have remembered to call me. Have you forgotten?" Zara's eyes were red, as if she had been wronged. "I didn't want to disturb your work, so I thought I could manage on my own, but I slipped and fell." As she spoke, tears were about to fall. "It's all my fault. I couldn't protect our baby, Nelson. You can blame me." Nelson walked over, hugged Zara tightly, and patted her back comfortingly. "It's okay. Maybe it's just not our destiny to have a baby. Just take good care of yourself. Everything will be fine, and I won't blame you." Zara nodded in his arms, but there was a hint of a smile on her lips. I frowned, feeling something was wrong. This scene reminded me of when I fell when I was pregnant with Malcolm. I was almost 7 months pregnant at that time, and my belly was so big that I could hardly see the road when I walked. I remember that day Nelson said he had brought me a gift to celebrate our wedding anniversary. I thought he had forgotten about it, but unexpectedly, he actually remembered to come home on time and bought a gift. I thought that our relationship could go back to the way it was, so I hurried downstairs to greet him. As a result, I didn't see the ground and tripped, falling to the ground. At that moment, I was so scared that I broke out in a cold sweat, and I saw Nelson's expression change. He ran over and asked me if I was hurt. I cried uncontrollably, and he carried me to the hospital. Fortunately, Malcolm was strong and nothing happened to him. But after I was discharged from the hospital, I didn't get the comfort I expected. Instead, he scolded me. "You're so pregnant, can't you be more careful? What if something happens to the baby? You're so old, how can you be so careless?" I remember my vision was blurred at that time, but in the end, I didn't hear a word of comfort. 9. I hate Nelson. I can't stand being around him anymore. I just want to get as far away from him as possible. I can't stand how tender and caring he is towards Zara. It constantly reminds me of the unfair treatment Malcolm and I received. I feel sorry for myself, and even more so for my child. Perhaps sensing something, Nelson, who was holding Zara, frowned and looked around, but found nothing unusual. Then his phone rang. On the other end of the line, Kendrick's voice trembled. "Nelson, Yara is gone." Nelson jumped to his feet, throwing Zara onto the bed. "What did you say? How could Yara be dead?" "Impossible, it can't be true." Kendrick paused and continued. "It's true. Yara had a car accident, the car fell off a cliff, and it was completely burned. If it weren't for an eyewitness, we might not have found her body." Nelson's face turned pale. "Kendrick, are you lying to me? Are you trying to get revenge on me for not letting Yara contact you?" "Ha ha ha." Kendrick laughed loudly, but it sounded like he was gnashing his teeth. "Nelson, isn't this what you want? Yara is dead, and Malcolm is dead too. You can just marry your new love into the Nelson family, can't you? Nelson, you are so heartless, you can even harm your own flesh and blood." "Wait a minute." Nelson paused. "You said Malcolm was my biological son. Isn't he your child?" Kendrick shouted. "Nelson, I've never touched Yara." "Nelson, you're such a fool." Nelson was completely stunned, his face as white as paper. He stood there shaking for a few seconds, then was supported by Zara. "Nelson, are you okay?" After a long time, Kendrick's voice came again. "Nelson, you are still with Zara now. Do you know how badly you've been deceived? The child in her belly is not yours, and you're foolishly being a father for someone else. It's ridiculous. Oh, by the way, Yara's body is still in the morgue, and the police have notified her family to identify it, but you're her only relative." Probably because he received too much information, Nelson just stood there motionless. After a long time, he slowly squatted down and curled up into a ball. "It's not true, it's all fake." He refused to believe that it was all true. I watched it all coldly, watching him curl up into a ball, watching the truth slowly destroy him. A sense of revenge surged through me. This was all the retribution Nelson deserved. It's just a pity that after all the truth was revealed, I didn't disappear immediately, and I still followed Nelson. 10. I followed Nelson to the funeral home. He stood at the door, as stiff as a board, unable to step inside for a long time. After what seemed like forever, he finally mustered up the courage to go in and lifted the white cloth. At that moment, his pupils dilated suddenly, and his hands clenched into fists. To be honest, I couldn't bear to look at it for a second longer. It was as black as charcoal, and only the curled-up bones could barely be recognized as a human shape. There was nothing else recognizable. The staff came in and asked him to sign the paperwork. Nelson handled everything until he was asked if he wanted to cremate the body immediately, and he panicked. No, wait a little longer. I haven't had a chance to say a few words to her yet. Please give me a little more time. Let me have a last word with my wife. So he still remembers that I'm his wife. I thought I was just his housekeeper. Nelson stood in front of me and began to talk to himself. "Yara, every time you appeared in front of me when I was a child, I wondered who this mischievous little girl was. You didn't look like a girl at all. But I'll never forget the smile you gave me. It was sunny, bright, and pure. You deeply attracted me, your enthusiasm, your cheerfulness. You were like a little sun, radiating warmth. And I subconsciously wanted to pay attention to you, help you out, and lie for you. Every time you winked at me, I thought you were so lively and interesting. At that time, I vowed to protect you and guard you for the rest of my life. When my grandfather asked me which girl I would choose, I chose you without hesitation. And you nodded in agreement. In each other's hearts, we were always special. But when did I start to feel like you were disappearing from my sight? Every time you got into trouble, Kendrick was by your side. Wasn't it us who met first? And wasn't it we who were attracted to each other? Yara, I'm sorry. I always thought that Malcolm wasn't my child. And I thought it was my fault for seeing you and Kendrick being intimate in a bar that night. I'm sorry to you. And I'm sorry to Malcolm. I remembered what happened that day. Oh, I remember now. It was my birthday that day. My Yara family went bankrupt, my parents passed away, and I spent my birthday alone. I called Nelson and asked if he could keep me company. The phone was noisy, and his words were broken, but I could barely hear him. He said, "I have something to do, you can find something to do yourself." The moment I hung up the phone, I clearly heard someone call Nelson. A chill ran down my spine. I went to a bar alone to drown my sorrows and met Kendrick there. Seeing a familiar face, I stopped holding back and started drinking heavily. By the end, I couldn't tell east from west, and I didn't know where I was. I only knew that Kendrick sent me home. It turned out that Nelson was there that day and saw me with Kendrick. I twitched at the corners of my mouth, feeling absurd. He saw it, but didn't even give me a chance to explain. He didn't trust me at all. Yara, I was wrong. Can you come back to me? Yara, I was wrong, please forgive me? He called out over and over again, but got no response. He lay on the bed, his shoulders shaking. Yara, I was wrong, I was a bastard, can you and Malcolm come back? I watched this man crying silently without any emotion. This is what Nelson deserved, isn't it? 11. After getting my ashes, Nelson locked himself in our room and wouldn't open the door no matter how much I called. I felt my condition getting worse and worse, and I felt like I might be released soon. Zara kept knocking on the door outside. Nelson, can you come out and eat something? Don't torture yourself like this. The deceased is gone, you have to look forward. The door to the room was suddenly pulled open by Nelson. His eyes were bloodshot, and his expression twisted. Zara, did you say that Malcolm was Yara and Kendrick's child? Zara seemed to be hurt by Nelson's grip, her face full of pain. Nelson, what do you mean? I was just saying that there was a possibility. But didn't you do the paternity test yourself? That was done in your uncle's hospital. It shouldn't be difficult to tamper with it, right? Kendrick walked in from outside, his eyes fixed on Nelson. The anger in his eyes was hard to hide. Zara was completely panicked. Kendrick, what are you talking about? Don't talk nonsense without evidence. Kendrick raised the paternity test report in his hand and handed it to Nelson. Look, this is the real report. When Nelson saw the number 99% at the end of the report, a pain flashed in his eyes. He suddenly grabbed Zara by the neck. You did it. Zara struggled violently, her face getting uglier and uglier. Let go, Nelson. She bit Nelson's arm. Nelson let go when it hurt. Zara covered her chest and panted, and sarcastically said, Nelson, you're so stupid, why blame others? Your relationship with Yara was already fragile. I just made up a few words, and you believed it. How noble can you be? Nelson covered his heart and pointed at Zara. Get out. You have no right to be here, get out. Zara sneered, picked up her bag and left directly, and before leaving, she didn't forget to mock Nelson. Idiot. Nelson's face turned pale. He was trembling all over, and he was panting heavily. I was wrong, I didn't trust Yara. I'm sorry to Yara, and I'm sorry to Malcolm. If she hadn't been so disappointed in me, she wouldn't have left in such a hurry, and she wouldn't have been in such a bad mood. If I had gone to see her then, and if I hadn't let her drive alone, maybe this wouldn't have happened. It's all my fault. Kendrick folded his arms and looked at him expressionlessly. Nelson, you deserve it. Yara is innocent, Malcolm is innocent, but they're both gone. Why didn't you die too? But it's good this way. I'm sure Yara and Malcolm don't want to see you. Nelson, do whatever you want. After saying that, Kendrick also turned and left, leaving Nelson sitting on the ground crying. 3 days later, Nelson held a funeral for me. The weather was as gloomy as the day Malcolm was buried. My grave is next to Malcolm's. Finally, I'm with my son and I won't be lonely anymore. Nelson stood in front of my grave, motionless. Until everyone else left, he still stood there. But I couldn't control him anymore. I saw Malcolm running towards me. He came to pick me up. My son, as before, threw himself into my lap. Mom, I miss you so much. I smiled and picked him up, kissing him on the cheek. Mom misses you too. Let's go then. My son nodded, hugged my neck, and looked back at Dad. I heard him say to his father, Dad, this time Mom and I are really leaving. I held my son and walked into the wind. Although I couldn't see what was ahead, I wouldn't be afraid as long as I had Malcolm with me.